Let us listen for God's word in the story of the Transfiguration as told in Mark 9, verses 2 to 8. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus.
Larry Walters always wanted to be able to fly. And he got old enough, he went into the military, hoped that he could be a pilot, but his eyesight wasn't good enough for that, and so his dream seemed to be lost. But then when he was in his early 30s, he decided that he would act on an idea that he'd had for a long time. He went to the Army surplus store and he bought 42 weather balloons. Now, a weather balloon is a big gray balloon, and when it's blowing up, it's about 7 feet in diameter. And then he went to the party supply store and got a few tanks of helium. And he went home and he filled all 42 weather balloons with helium and attached them to a backyard lawn chair. One of those aluminum ones, with the nylon webbing. And he tethered it to the bumper of his girlfriend's car in her backyard. And then he climbed on. He had some peanut butter sandwiches with him. Some people say he had a couple of beers, but we don't know if that's true or not. And he had a CB radio so he could, call from wherever he landed to come and get him. And they cut the tether. Now, what Larry expected is that he would rise gently into the air 30, 50, maybe 100 feet, and that he would lazily drift around in his neighborhood for a few hours, enjoying the flight. And then he had an air pistol with him, a pellet gun, and he would then shoot a couple of the air balloons, and that would allow him to drift gently back into Earth, and he would land somewhere in a park. None of that happened. Larry, in fact, shot up into the air 100 feet, 1,000 feet, 5,000 feet, 10,000 feet. He leveled off at 16,000 feet. Now, Larry hadn't even bothered to strap himself into his chair. He was too scared to pop any of the balloons because they might unbalance him and he would hurtle to his death 16,000 feet. So he just sat there, but it was freezing cold at 16,000 feet, as you can imagine. And he'd shot up so quickly that his glasses blew off. This is the only picture we have. He had a camera with him, but he didn't take any pictures. I don't think he wanted to let go of the arms of his chair. 16,000 feet. He eventually drifted over into the restricted airspace of Long Beach Airport, where he was seen by at least 2 commercial flights. And I don't think we have a record, but you can imagine what the pilot would be saying. Tower, this is Delta Flight 799er. I'm on a final approach at an altitude of 16,000 feet. I just passed a guy in a lawn chair. That's very much actually what was said. Eventually, it got so cold and he was so miserable and so scared of all these planes that he did shoot out a couple of balloons, and then he was so cold and so nervous he dropped the gun. But he did slowly drift back to Earth. The balloons got tangled up in a power line, cut the power out to a whole neighborhood. Larry ended up hanging in his lawn chair about 5 feet above the ground, and he just climbed off. Now, I tell you that story for two reasons. Three reasons. It's a great story. Lawrence Richard Walters, known forever as Lawn Chair Larry. When he was asked if he had been scared, he said, "Yes, wonderfully so." To be wonderfully afraid. I think we're told terrified in the Bible, but I like to wonderfully afraid the disciples on Transfiguration, that Transfiguration event. And the second reason I mention it is because Larry had an experience, a vertical experience, but he was never able to translate that into a horizontal experience. Now, he did get a free trip to New York where he appeared on the David Letterman show. The Smithsonian called to ask if they could have the lawn chair, but he'd given it to some kid in the neighborhood and lost track of it. So he was never able to turn that vertical experience and lengthen it into a horizontal one. And I think we have that lesson this morning too. So the theologian Frederick Buechner, a wonderful writer, says this. In the Transfiguration, he writes, "It was the holiness of Jesus shining through his humanness, his face so afire with it that they were almost blinded." Even with us, something like that happens once in a while. The face of a man walking his child in the park, of a woman picking peas in the garden, of sometimes the unlikeliest person listening to a concert, say, or standing barefoot in the sand watching the waves roll in, or just having a beer at a Saturday baseball game in July. Every once and so often, something so touching, so incandescent, so alive, so transfigures the human face that it's almost beyond bearing. Or here in Saskatoon, down by the river, and the mist coming off the water and the sun just poking through, and you have that moment when it seems like the whole universe is holding its breath. And the quality of aliveness is just so clear and so present. It's almost beyond bearing. Or you're camping and a deer wanders out of the brush into your campsite and the two of you look at each other as equals, two living creatures. And again, the clarity of that being alive, almost beyond bearing. Those are religious experiences, vertical experiences, experiences of heightened spirituality. We've all had them, I know. And in some ways, they're not so very different from what Mark describes on that mountaintop. And it's partly because of the Transfiguration. We call those mountaintop experiences. Now, the scene that Mark describes is spectacular, with dazzling clothes and shining faces and a conversation with people who have not walked on the face of the earth for hundreds of years. If you're asking the question, and it's always the wrong question to ask, did it really happen that way? That question goes nowhere. The question to ask is, what does it mean? Why did Mark choose to include that story? Why did he stick it in chapter 9? Well, the short answer to those questions is that the story reaffirms Jesus' identity. You may remember that in Mark's gospel, when Jesus was baptized, he heard a voice from heaven saying, "You are my son, the beloved." And now that title is stated again in the hearing of the disciples. "This is my son, the beloved." And it's here at the beginning of chapter 9 because at the end of chapter 8, Jesus had spoken to the disciples for the first time to tell them about his coming death and resurrection. Of course, they didn't understand. But here, they have a taste of the resurrection, the resurrected Christ. But the part of the story that captures my imagination, at least this year, is Peter's response. Now, Mark reminds us that the disciples were wonderfully afraid, so much so that they didn't know what to say. And so Peter blurts out, "Rabbi, And he interrupts their conversation to do this. Rabbi, let's put up 3 tents, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. And you may be wondering why it's Moses and Elijah. Why, of all the characters in the Bible, would Jesus be having a confab with Moses and Elijah? And the answer seems to be that Moses and Elijah represent the 2 great narratives of the Bible. The law, Moses, the law, and Elijah, the prophets. That is to say, Moses represents right living. Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't commit murder, do unto others, love God and love your neighbor. Right living, the law. And Elijah represents fair dealing. Now, fair dealing is, of course, part and parcel of right living, but fair dealing is the part of right living that the rich and powerful tend to forget about most easily. And it's the role of the prophets to remind them about it. And so here Mark's message seems pretty clear. Moses and Elijah are partners with Jesus in his earthly enterprise. The way of Jesus is the way of right living and fair dealing. And I remind you, that has not changed. We know we are being faithful when we are guided by those 2 landmarks, however you want to conceive them, the law and the prophets, right living and fair dealing, faith and justice, those 2. But let's get back to the mountaintop. Let's build something, says Peter. A memorial of some kind. He's just had one of the most intense experiences of verticality in the entire Bible, and he wants to make it horizontal right away. He wants to take the spiritual and make it physical. He wants to take the ineffable and make it mundane. He wants to take that mountaintop experience and build a roadside historical marker. If Peter had had a cell phone, he would have interrupted their conversation to get a selfie with Moses and Elijah. That's how inappropriate his comment was. But Peter's not alone in his impulse to build. I went online and looked up a 7-day tour of the Holy Land. And it included a visit to the Basilica of the Annunciation, built on the very spot where the angel Gabriel announced to Mary that she was pregnant. Also to Dormition Abbey, built where Mary fell into her eternal slumber. And the Church of the Visitation, where Mary spoke the Magnificat to her cousin Elizabeth. And not 1, but 2 churches in the Shepherd's Field, where the angels announced the birth of Christ. And of course, in Bethlehem itself, the Church of the Nativity, built on the exact spot where Jesus was born. Now, nobody knows where any of those events took place, where any of those places are, and yet there are buildings to mark the spot anyway. Peter's impulse to take the moment and make it last is very strong. I read something this week about organized religion and the tension within that phrase. It's the tension between the vertical and the horizontal, between that mountaintop experience that is almost beyond bearing. An experience that I'm sure we have all shared, that is the proof and the very embodiment of religious experience, but that is fleeting and ethereal and just can't be grabbed onto. So that's the religion part. The tension is with the organized part of organized religion. There's an irresistible impulse to try to quantify that mountaintop experience, to agree on a glossary of words that we can use to try to describe the indescribable, to give a rational structure within which we can draw on that experience, to seek it out and try and make it happen again, to gain that elusive verticality. At its best, the horizontal impulse helps us to share our unique experiences, our experiences of the holy, and to find the commonalities between them. At its worst, We try to box it up and tell other people that, no, your experience isn't valid because it wasn't like mine. The impulse to horizontalism isn't wrong. In this symbol behind me on the wall, we have the vertical and the horizontal. We have that. But it's tricky, this horizontal part, because unless we're careful, the organization can become more important than the religion. Organized religion, at its worst, it's the Inquisition and the Holocaust and Indian residential schools. At its best, it is a community of like-minded people who draw on their shared mountaintop experience of being wonderfully afraid, and who gather together to sing and to pray and to talk about their faith, to talk about that experience, and who are committed to right living and fair dealing, both in our personal lives and in our lives in that wider community, our city, our nation, the world community. Here at St. Martin's, we say about ourselves, following in the path of Jesus, we seek to live faithfully in the midst of our everyday lives. And we define ourselves by this mission statement. We commit to living in right relationship with our Creator, with ourselves, and with the wider community. Now, I know that happens imperfectly. But on a good day, we use our vertical experience of the resurrected Christ to inform and to empower our reaching out to each other and to those around us. This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him. And suddenly, when we looked around, we saw no one with us anymore, but only Jesus. Amen.